Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name's Roger Ream. I'm the president of the Fund for American Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. I think we've got an outstanding program for you, and you're really going to enjoy it. I'd like to take just a few minutes before we begin with that program to tell you a little bit about the Fund for American Studies. The organization was founded in 1967, so we're coming up on our 60th year working to educate young people. Our mission is to develop courageous leaders who could protect our country's heritage of limited government and economic freedom. Our graduates go on to careers not only in government and public policy and journalism, international affairs, the law, but they also are leaders in their communities and in their neighborhoods, and as well as in the life of the nation and around the world. We've run programs in Asia, Europe, and South America, as well as the United States. So we've got a great network that spans the globe. We consider it an obligation for every generation to prepare the leaders who will guide our country in the future. We are an experiment in liberty, and like every experiment, the outcome is not certain. So every year, every decade, new leaders come and take over that experiment. The United States is, of course, the oldest democratic republic on the planet. That alone makes us exceptional, that we've lasted for 250 years. But we're not just exceptional because of longevity, but also because of those ideas that inspired the American founding, that are encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence. And this year, in our semi-quincentennial, fortunately, there'll be increased focus on those ideas. In recent decades, our founding story has often been obscured or come under attack, not only in curriculum in our schools, but in the popular culture. We've failed to transmit these ideas effectively to the rising generation, and polls show that many young people, a frightening number of young people, are not proud of our nation's history and our heritage, and they're supporting socialism over our free market economy. There are textbooks in our schools like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. There's the New York Times 1619 Project, and things like that that create a generation that is lacking in appreciation for our history. I recently heard a story that was told to me about a young lady who worked as a park ranger in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, our birthplace as a nation. She mentioned that one particular visitor had held a special place in her heart, a certain 10-year-old boy who came to see the Liberty Bell. Because the bell is so fragile, already has a crack in it, of course, from when it was first rung, there's a rule that you can't touch it. There's a guard that stands there to make sure nobody does touch the Liberty Bell. But one day, while this ranger was guarding the bell, a mother asked if her son could touch the bell. And the ranger explained, no one can touch it. And then the mother explained that her little boy was blind. So this ranger picked up the boy and let him run his hands along the bell to experience it really the only way he could, being blind. She even let him feel the crack that was in the bell and guided his hand over the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land and unto all the inhabitants thereof." Well, this little boy got to experience this priceless piece of history in a way very few others have, because someone was there to lift him up and let him touch the bell. Well, that story, I think, in a nutshell, kind of captures what I think we're doing at the Fund for American Studies in our high school and college programs. We're lifting young people up so they can really have an encounter with the ideas of liberty. I was reminded of that, an example of that last summer toward the end of our summer program for college students in Washington. We had some 300 students there for the summer. They were taking courses, they were interning around Washington, D.C., having a great experience. And in a week before the program ended, I invited 2 donors over to have lunch with some of the students whose scholarships they had provided. And we sat around the table at our office and eating lunch, and one of these donors, a woman actually in her 80s, said to the students, I'd like to go around the room and each of the 8 of you tell me what was the highlight of the summer for you. So we start around the room, and the first student in the line said, well, the highlight for me was reading the Declaration of Independence. He said, our professor in our government course spent 2 days going through the Declaration of Independence, word for word, deconstructing it, talking about what led the founders to write that sentence, who were they drawing from. It was just amazing. He said, I don't think I'd ever read the Declaration of Independence before, maybe in 7th grade civics. And as we went around the room, another student talked about the highlight being their internship. Another was, something they did with other students during the summer. And then a 4th or 5th student also said, yeah, it was reading the Declaration of Independence in the government class. And I was really struck by that here are these young people who are going to be leaders in the future. And they're suggesting, first of all, they weren't that familiar with our Declaration of Independence, and that the opportunity to read it just slowly, line by line, was transformative for them. One of them even said that, he fell in love with these ideas all over again. And so that's an encounter that happens in our courses. Professor Ann Bradley, who we'll be hearing from in a little bit, who leads our economics faculty and teaches economics in our program. Her courses, her classes are transformative in helping kids understand the way the world works, and she'll be talking a little bit about that. So we work to ensure that young people are exposed to important ideas that will help guide them, whatever career they go into. And then finally, I thought I'd mention one other example of the way we're operating, and I'll just take, for example, our journalism track. Through what we're doing in journalism, we're now sponsoring about 30 college newspapers, independent college newspapers on campuses around the country. We're at all the Ivy League schools, a lot of the large publics, and we are actually looking at SMU and Rice. I think we've already established a paper at SMU. But what we're doing is we've got over 700 undergraduates in our journalism network. And we do training sessions for them. We give grants to the college newspapers so they can publish. And then from that group, we've trained about 25 of them through our media transparency project to do investigative journalism on campus, to try to uncover things that are going on. This week at UNC, at University of North Carolina, they found some of the administrators there who were violating the state law when it comes to free speech by trying to punish students for things they were writing in one of the mainline school paper there, and our guys came to their defense. But it's doing that kind of investigative journalism. And then when these students graduate from college, we have internships in Washington for them to work in the summer through our institute there for journalists. And then we've been selecting 3 each year and paying their salaries to work for 9 months on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. And there's very little better training than working on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. It's like being a clerk for a Supreme Court justice in terms of the boost it gives you in your career. The Wall Street Journal has now hired 4 of our fellows. They're the Joseph Rago Fellows, and they're there full time. One, Elliot Kaufman, our first in 2018, is on the editorial board. And the other 3 are editing the columnists and writing their own byline pieces and are full-time employees. One who wasn't hired there is now on the editorial board, just hired at the Washington Post, which is a paper being transformed by Jeff Bezos. They've hired several of our graduates to work there. And now we've just announced, in addition to the Wall Street Journal, 4 new fellowships at the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Economist magazine, and the Dispatch. So we're in the process of selecting 4 more fellows for these career jobs. So it just gives you an example of, in one area where we take students from college through into careers where they can flourish and be honorable leaders and courageous leaders. We're doing high school programs around the country. We have 30 scheduled this summer on college campuses, week-long high school programs. We'll be at Rice this summer. If anyone want to visit the program at Rice, talk to Ed Turner or John Demos here. They'll be happy to arrange that. So that's just a snapshot of what we do. I want to thank the sponsors of this event today and our supporters who are here for that support that makes our work possible. And now, without further ado, I'll kind of introduce our program. First up, you'll hear from David Bopp. He's the president and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute, an organization that he has really taken to new heights under his leadership, that's working around the country to help improve civic education and history education in the United States. And he'll tell you about some of the work he does. And my colleague Lindsay Craig will also lead a conversation with David. Following David, you'll hear from Ann Bradley, as I said, our academic director, who's also the George and Sally Meyer Fellow at the Fund for American Studies, and is just an outstanding teacher and writer on economics. She really makes it come to life for our students, and she'll be joined into conversation with Shane Lowry, who is a student at Baylor, getting his PhD, who was one of our Woodhouse Public Policy Fellows. And finally, last is, after a break, you'll hear from one of our alums, and then our keynote address by Lord Daniel Hannan, who's a member of the British Parliament in the House of Lords, and is just outstanding. We were in Dallas last night, and he spoke for us there. He's our America 250 visiting fellow this year, and he's traveling around the country to talk about why the American founding is so important to the rest of the world. So without further ado, please welcome David Bopp to the stage. David.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and Roger, Lindsay, for having me today. This is a real pleasure to be with you. I'm going to speak for just about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, as Roger said, about kind of the state of civic education today. 250 years is a remarkable accomplishment. I was talking to a group of really little kids recently, and we were trying to figure out together, is 250 years old or young? You know, because in a way, you think of it, Roger's right, we're the oldest democratic republic. But yet, in the nature of civilizations and human history, we're pretty young. My question to you today is, how will we live and structure ourselves as a people so that we might have another 250 years? What are the essential ingredients that will make that possible? I'll suggest to you one indispensable thing will be the kind of work that every day the Fund for American Studies does, and that is equipping young people to never take for granted the fact that we do and have had the blessings of liberty for 250 years. When you look at the essential result, or what really civics yields, to me, civics is about the study of the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. I work at an organization called the Bill of Rights Institute, but we look at the touchstone documents so that young people might come to an appreciation and that they can become principled, productive citizens. Civics is not so much just a course that you might take, in 7th grade or 10th grade, as it is really a mentality. It's a way of looking at life, and a way of coming to understand that citizenship is not just for other older people. One of the things that I love about TFAS, among many things, is that it really equips young people to start right away. You don't have to wait for 10 or 15 years. You need to jump right in and build those skills and acquire the civic virtues so that you can be a principled, productive American citizen. Why then do we see the challenging, daunting even, survey results that young people are so much less patriotic than older generations? I won't ask for show of hands here, but I did want to run through one quick data point. If you start with Gen Z, and this is not an effort to beat up on that generation, I really think that that is not the direction that we want to go, right? Every Constitution Day, there's this kind of ritualistic flagellation of teachers and students saying, look at them, they're ignorant, they're apathetic. What's wrong with teenagers these days, right? 86% of the adjectives that we use to describe teenagers are negative. I have 2 of them at home. I know and can identify with that negativity. But think of it, that really robs them of that potential. But here's the data. 41% of Gen Z are very or extremely proud to be an American. It goes up in percentage in terms of patriotic pride to millennials at about 58%, so you're jumping up from 41 to 58%. And then Gen X, 71% are very or extremely proud to be an American. Boomers are 75%, and then the silent or greatest generation at about 83%. What I'll suggest to you briefly, and we don't have time to go into all of it today, but I did bring my copy of A People's History of the United States. This may be the first time in a TFAS program that ever a copy of Howard Zinn's tome has been held up. But the reason that I wanted to give this to you today is to just read one quick passage, because Roger alluded to this thing. And he also mentioned the New York Times, and I'll offer a quotation from there. Here is how Howard Zinn, on page 646 of this very long volume, characterizes our American way of life. And here I'm quoting, "The American system is the most ingenious system of control in world history. With a country so rich in natural resources, talent, and labor power, the system can afford to distribute just enough wealth to just enough people to limit discontent to a troublesome minority. It is a country so powerful, so big, so pleasing to many of its citizens that it can afford to give freedom of dissent to the small number who are not pleased." The operative adjective, the operative word that Zinn uses throughout this book to characterize America is control. I think of a different word. I think of opportunity. That's the juxtaposition. For generations, classroom teachers have turned to this resource, as much as college professors have, because they say it relates a good story. And in fact, it does. I disagree with nearly every part of Howard Zinn's argument, but I have to give him credit for weaving a tale that is quite intoxicating. It has the inconvenience of being almost wholly untrue. The New York Times kind of said, "We see your Howard Zinn, and we'll raise you." And they set out in this project, which was published a few years ago, to undo, really, to combat, to challenge directly the idea that America is in any way exceptional. And their core argument that was that the real American founding, that was the language that the New York Times used, was 1619, when the first transatlantic slaves arrived on our shores, not 1776. And that we were born of a lie. Now think of that. That's quite an allegation to make. What most young people today know about our country, sadly, are the negative things. They have not come to an appreciation because we have not done the job that we need to in our systems of education. There are so many bright spots, and I'm not here to be negative about the future, actually, because what I do at the Bill of Rights Institute is support a wonderful group of about 95,000 educators, most of whom teach in our district schools. These teachers are in all 50 states in the District of Columbia, and they every day wake up to be able to enable their students to understand the American story and its principles. We organize everything at the Bill of Rights Institute by the founding principles and the civic virtues. And you know, the interesting thing about young people is you can't acquire virtue on their behalf. You can't dish knowledge to them, right? They have to take it up and internalize it themselves. You can't love what you don't know. And our objective every day at the Bill of Rights Institute is to equip these teachers with classroom materials, from one lesson plan to a video to comprehensive digital resources in American history, government and politics, and civics, so that teachers can set aside the crummy textbooks that the taxpayers fund, and books like Howard Zinn, and actually dig into primary source documents. It's not to say that they're proselytizing, because good teaching never, in fact, is about indoctrination. It's about a kind of point-counterpoint. It's what the medievals called a kind of disputatio, right? That you can put different points of view in front of young people and let them wrestle with it. They do need to examine our history. They need to interrogate the ideas of the American founding. But when you start with the presumption of guilt, that is never going to be real learning. You need to offer the opportunity for young people to grapple with these ideas. And what we see every day in millions of young people's lives is that that challenge is one that they take up with real zeal. They love it, and it sets them on a kind of trajectory toward understanding that the Declaration of Independence, that document that we now have an opportunity to celebrate, the Declaration can set them on a lifelong practice of the pursuit of happiness. The objective that we have today, I think, is to be able to really see 250 years of American success, prosperity, opportunity, is the inculcation of virtue. Right now, the sentiment that I see a lot of times when I'm on different campuses is a sentiment of kind of, I hate to say it, but resentment. We have given students in so many institutions a full course load of grievance studies, and we are seeing the results of that. What if we flipped that and we said, yes, patriotism for sure, that is a virtue, but what does it mean to have gratitude? Gratitude to those who put those words on paper, who fought for those words and that idea, and who made sure that it would be the farthest thing from a lie, but a truth on which we could anchor a regime. That gratitude is not forced. It's invited. I want to give you a couple of quick examples, because if we think of our struggle here about knowledge, virtue, and skills building, kind of in that Tocquevillian art of association, right? How do young people come to practice these ideas? There are cardinal vices just as much as there are cardinal virtues. Cardinal means hinge, right? The root word of that, cardate, is a hinge virtue. Courage, for example, is a hinge. It enables you to do and to put into place and to practice all of the other virtues. So think, for example, of the virtue of courage. It's the mean between two extremes. On one extreme, you can be rash and run headlong into battle, not having a good plan. That's bad. On the other hand, you might be a coward and not even be able to take the field. Think here of George Washington. I hope you all on July 3rd, as you gather and think about what you're going to be doing with your families, will see a major motion picture. It's a film called Young Washington. The Bill of Rights Institute has been pleased to be the official content or curriculum partner of this project that's done by a new film studio called Wonder Project. And the reason that I mention courage to you is because at the heart of this movie is the question for young Washington, the title of the film. What is he going to do? Who is he going to be? You know, we kind of think of the American founding success as foreordained. Of course they were going to succeed. It was written in the stars. And in fact, it wasn't. George Washington, when he was young, had no idea who he was going to be. He did have a big ego. I tell my students that if he had been on Instagram, George Washington would have had all kinds of selfies of himself in his uniform. He was kind of vain, and he was an ego guy. He was really set out to be what we today might even call an influencer. He wanted to be famous. And he, just barely past being a teenager, touched off a global war. How many young people can lay claim to doing that? That's pretty big, right? The French and Indian War resulted in no small part because of Washington's rashness. In this movie, where you can see the trailer, you can also see a few clips, My favorite line from the whole movie is when Washington realizes that these early failures will be a crucible moment in his own life. He's not yet 25 years of age. And he says, failure is the greatest teacher. Failure is the greatest teacher. Washington didn't know if his effort, his life was going to be a success. The American founders did not know if their experiment was going to work. We do today. What are we going to do to ensure that we have another 250 years? I'll stop there, and we'll look forward to having a conversation and getting to some of the questions that you might have about civics and how we mount an effort to really educate young people. But thanks so much for your time.
So we're going to go back again 250 years. One of the things that you mentioned in your talk right here was what the role of a citizen is. And as you well know and teach, the original concept that the founders had for the role of a citizen and why it was very important to have an educated citizenry, as Jefferson would write, and I think that we many times think that that was reading, writing, and arithmetic, but actually he meant that they need to understand what the role of a citizen is, to really understand what their responsibilities are, how they participate in this democracy, a republic if we can keep it. And so I think that this is one of the things that we can sort of like dive into a little bit, right? As we're developing courageous citizens, what is a citizen?
Well, a citizen is not a subject, for one. There's a really interesting moment. So Jefferson had 17 days to write the Declaration of Independence. Some of you may have been to the house in which he wrote that in Philadelphia. He's sitting there, he's drawing from memory, and you know how if you write something down and if you're using a pen, we don't write with pens as much anymore, or much less ink and quill pens. But he wrote a word. And that word he really wanted to scratch out, and he really didn't want anybody to see what he had written. On top of it, he wrote the word citizens. And it was only in 2010 that we knew what word he had written originally. And that's because the Library of Congress was able to use a special technology to scrape back the ink. The word that he had written originally was subjects. When we move from being subjects to citizens, it's everything about opportunity. Think of how shrunken your view is when all you have is fealty to a monarch. That is not what Jefferson and the founders had in mind. They wanted to open up the whole possibilities of self-government. If decisions are made for you, you're not self-governing. If you are in charge of your own life and can operate according to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you have real freedom. That's what it means to be a citizen. I think the last thing I'd say about citizenship there that's so important is it's really rooted in the idea of virtue. Happiness was not a kind of fleeting thing. It wasn't just pleasure. It was rather the contentment that comes, the state of being that comes with moral and civic virtue. And so only a virtuous people, Benjamin Franklin said, are capable of freedom. So citizenship comes with it the rights for sure, but also those responsibilities.
You know what I think is interesting in the way that your organization and I think so many others in sort of diving into how can we create supplemental educational programs to teach about civics, also sort of has opened up the Pandora's box, as you say, about 1619 Project and what all happened there. What I think is really interesting and something that I think if people are just several steps away from, you know, the intimate work that you're doing in this area, is that it's not so clear what the origin intention of the people who were trying to launch the 1619 Project and also purposefully change the way that we teach about the American founding over so many years. And to your point about you know, the people's history here, it's if we don't have a population who is patriotic, right? Who don't think, wow, this is a wonderful place. They're not going to sign up for the military. They're not going to participate necessarily in mediating structures in their local communities where they can solve problems on their own. And then they're also not going to advocate for the kinds of civic institutions that can help to solve those problems. And I think that young people today have gotten very comfortable, would you agree, with the notion that somebody else should solve my problem, right? I'm not going to solve the problem myself. But that is exactly what the founders wrote about as well. And I think also on the converse side, but tell me what you think, is this is what Tocqueville wrote about when he came to America, to say, wow, these people actually can solve a lot of problems on their own, and they don't necessarily need to look to government to solve their problems. They have created all these mediating structures. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that's evolved over time.
You know, it was a couple generations ago that in American district schools, in public schools, we would have courses called Problems of Democracy. This was a very interesting concept, and I think rather a good one. Civics, though, right now, for many students, means government. And I think making civics coterminous with government has led them to that kind of false belief that all of our problems, the main engine of our progress, in fact, has been government. Think of it. Tocqueville portrayed and saw a very different America. You would learn the kind of, from the arts of association, you know, from the clubs, from your church life, from other things that were part of civil society. Having learned that well then, you'd port it over to politics. If you reverse the cycle, you learn in politics and try to boil the ocean like a lot of action civics programs do, right? They encourage young people to tackle kind of a almost global issue. And then if that doesn't work, what is the young person to do? Well, oftentimes they become despondent about the democratic small d project, right? They say, it's been rigged. Howard Zinn is right. The whole thing has been rigged against me. My activism did not yield the results that I want, and I'm mad. If you do it the Tocqueville way, though, what you start to see is that kind of civic skills building can best be applied at the local level. You have to have a grounding in knowledge. No matter the era, where the era of AI takes us, I will argue that young people need to know in their heads and hearts a great deal about American ideas and institutions. It is not sufficient to point to your phone, however powerful it becomes, and say, it knows it on my behalf. You have to know it in your head, and you have to know it in your heart. And that process takes a long time. That's why I think the projects and programs that TFAS runs are so vital, because they're saying, you need to do the work. We can't do the work on your behalf. You have to internalize these ideas. Then take the opportunity to apply them in your local communities. If you fail, you know what? You can get back up and try again. We have a project at the Bill of Rights Institute called My Impact Challenge. And we had a couple of young women that were trying to start a farmer's market. When you think about it, it's a more complex task than most realize. You have to understand, what levers do I need to pull on? How do I raise some money? How would I get this started for my community? Their initial project was a flop, but we still rewarded them with some scholarship dollars to keep at it. And they did, and then they succeeded. There's a lot of talk of resiliency today. Resiliency is one of those virtues that we want to come concomitant with patriotism. You gain resiliency by picking yourself up and continuing to try after you have failed. But we need to get away from this kind of safetyism, what Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt have called safetyism, where young people kind of grow up in this NERF environment, where they're not really being challenged to go out and try to put these principles into practice.
Yeah, we're going to get to questions, so think of some questions, everyone. Just one more question for you, though. Just building off of that point, I think that this is one of the things that I have found that I love so much about organizations like TFAS and Bill of Rights and Jack Miller and so many of the FEE and all these groups that are working with young people, is that the alumni almost universally use the word inspired. Mm-hmm. Right, to talk about what the programs meant to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that is important for all of us to recognize as not necessarily what they say when they come home from school. They don't come home from school. How was school today? Oh, I was so inspired by my history teacher, right? They take one of these programs and they're really inspired. And I think that that's a really important differentiating factor. Part of it is probably because of what we're teaching, the way that we're teaching. We're trying to inspire them, but so should the schools. And so I think that, we think of that as our mission, but it's an important differentiation, I think, in the way that the students are responding to having this content delivered to them.
Absolutely. Inspiration is so critical. How many of you have curled up in front of the fireplace with your favorite textbook? Right? Never happens. I mean, what inspires you are ideas and exemplars. When the United States turned 150 years old, Calvin Coolidge gave a speech that came to be known as the Inspiration of the Declaration. And it's a really beautiful speech. I'd encourage you to go read it. In it, he argues that when Jefferson and the founders wrote, "All men are created equal," that the truth of that statement, that all human beings have rights that are given to them by a creator, among which are life lived in pursuit of happiness, the truth of that statement was final. There's no improving on that particular statement. What we have to do, though, is put it into practice. Right? We have to live up to that promise. And so I think the idea of inspiration and what our schools should do, it wasn't that long ago that most of the mission statements, you have to go back 3 generations, so it's in the distant rearview mirror now, but most of our district school mission statements talked about the civic importance. Now, if you see any mention of civics, it's about global citizenship. Global citizenship is an oxymoron. There is no such thing. Your attachment in America is to an idea and to a home. And the truth of that coming clearly to students can be nothing except inspirational when done well. I'll offer here a note of hope. Many of our teachers get that. A lot of teachers are portrayed as if they are only proselytizing for an agenda kind of like Howard's Inn or the 1619 Project. We have not found that to be the case. In this state, the Bill of Rights Institute has some 8,000 teachers that we support, and they're doing amazing work. It's not to say that teachers are perfect in being non-ideological, but what I have found over the years is that many of them have a kind of self-policing amongst themselves. And when one is trying to win students over for a particular ideology, others come and say, is that really what we want to have happen in this school building, in this place? And in fact, many teachers feel much more attached to these ideas than we would think. And they feel quite alienated from the bosses in their unions. Most people don't wake up and think about politics in America. And that is actually a good thing. As we were talking about, right, the idea of a citizen is to be active in civil society. That's where the real engine of progress has been made. The same holds true for teachers. Most of them don't wake up in the morning thinking how they can proselytize their kids into a particular belief. American history as one of unrelenting arrogance. That is Howard Zinn's argument. And I, in fact, think the opposite. I think our example to the world for much of our history, we have not been a paragon of this virtue always. But to have a humility that would say, first, we're going to put all of these ideas to the people and let them ratify it. And we're going to keep going back to the corrective mechanism of the Declaration. This book has inspired one that will be out June 2nd. And it's called Divided Over the Declaration. And my argument really briefly in that book is that we have been propelled forward in our history by an enduring debate. And that debate has been over our principles. And we've been divided over the Declaration so that we might be united in those principles. That debate will have to continue for another 250 years for us to be successful.
Okay, some other questions? Over there.
Thank you, very interesting. When you think about revolutions, there have been other revolutions in history for sure, some modern and some old. and some of them came from people who were economically downtrodden. And instead of coming out with the theory of a citizen, they came out with this theory of a comrade, something that somehow suggested equality. And I think what our youth today are becoming more enamored with the concept of some sort of economic reality, because I think some of them feel they're in a position like revolutionaries in Cuba or revolutionaries in Russia, where they are economically don't see their opportunities, and therefore they want to see everybody somehow get equal by taking from the rich and giving to the poor. So I just wonder how you think about that as we go forward for the next 50 to 250 years.
It's I think a really interesting framing. I'll give you a quick story. So I was at a gathering of students, one of whom was wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt. And a Chinese American student approached this young man who was wearing the Che shirt and said, "Hey, dude, do you know who that guy was?" He said, "Yeah, it's Che Guevara, he was great." And he said, "His ideas killed my grandparents." The kid wearing the t-shirt responded, "Dude, I had no idea." We do need to teach that history, because the American Revolution was a revolution unlike no other, right? It was really, the idea back then was that you'd come full circle. When John Adams was asked in 1818 what was the American Revolution about, he said it was the radical change in ideas and sentiments. And by radical, he didn't mean radical as in questioning the very idea of what it means to be a human being. That's what you are getting at when you say comrade, right? The new Soviet man, the Übermensch, the idea of the Jacobins was we are going to create the world anew because we're going to escape and slip the bonds of human nature. That is an impossible idea. It's the kind of essence of ideology, and it's very intoxicating because it suggests that we can create something completely new, and this new kind of comradeship will give us utopia. That is exactly why Howard Zinn has been so intoxicating. And that's why we have to meet it with a vision that is really, truly inspiring.
And I know that Anne, who's coming up next, will be able to explore that exact thought a little bit more. Let's take these two questions right here, and then we will wrap up so we can get to our next panel.
Thanks so much. Very enlightening. How do you deal with the teachers who are influenced by Zinn? You know, going directly to the students is always an excellent choice, but the teachers, especially in public schools, are the gatekeepers. What's your thoughts on that?
You know, there's an open secret now among teachers and school systems that they take the taxpayer-funded textbook and ditch it, and then kind of curate their own curriculum. That's particularly true in middle school and high school. And increasingly what they choose is things that are going to resonate with students. Students depart entirely from these textbooks. You know, in college they don't use them hardly at all, and in most community colleges they're promising open education resources, free to the end user resources. So what we find is if we design with students in mind, and videos that are actually compelling, curricula that actually students want to use, the teachers pick it up. And in that sense, our design principle is to really go to the student as customer. Teachers, we find, are really interested in engagement, and their programs very often have not grounded them strongly enough in content mastery. They need more content instruction. For example, you know, the way to get a pay bump in nearly every school district across the United States is to earn a master's degree. And it doesn't matter whether that master's degree is in content or not. So of course, a lot of teachers take a easier path, get it in something like pedagogy, and take the pay increase. We do need to have some structural reforms, but this is one thing that the Bill of Rights Institute is trying by providing material directly to the teacher.
Let's just do one quick question, but one thing I do want to just mention on behalf of Bill of Rights, they have a lot of this content on their website. So if you have kids or grandkids that you would like to inspire with different curricula, actually you can just go right online and get it yourself. Go ahead.
Underlying your remarks, it seems like you know, civics has to be more, as you say, than just government. It's not just about training staffers to go into Congress or something. And I was interested in what you said about the Bill of Rights Institute's engagement with that Young Washington movie. Could you speak more about just the importance of that front, the effect Hollywood has had, and you know, the importance of poetry or the images we have of the founders?
Old and wrinkled and tri-cornered hats, and fife and drum music, right? And of course, part of that's true, but we don't think of them as poised for this kind of immense world of possibility. Hamilton did a little bit to change that. Kids do know Hamilton very well, they know it by heart. But isn't it remarkable, here we are less than 100 days out from July 4th, 2026, and this will be the only major film about the American founding. So in large measure, what we've seen is not so much a bunch of propagandistic films, though there have been some kind of homages to Howard Zinn's work, as just a complete absence. Where are the films about Frederick Douglass, about the sweep of American history in an inspiring way? The good news, there's a lot more that's in the pipeline, and we're really excited about this film. So go out and see it on July 3rd, take your kids and grandkids, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, David. I just want to say in recapping, one of the things that I think is so inspiring for all of us who work in the movement and for to meet all of our supporters who are helping us with this effort is that there are a lot of different organizations now that are working in this area. And I think that this opportunity of the 250th to use people's sort of heightened awareness of looking at the American founding provides us a really amazing opportunity to educate about what the current situation is, be able to showcase how we can be problem solvers, and to showcase that there are a lot of organizations that are looking to solve the problem, so that soon we can have a whole lot of courageous citizens who will stand up and defend this great nation of ours. So thank you, and thank you to all of you. And here's Ann Bradley.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Roger and Lindsay for setting up such a great program. I am going to just go over a few things before we get into the Q&A, which will also be great. But I want to begin with a fact, because you know I'm an economist, so we like data, that many of you perhaps do not know. And it goes back to 1774. On the eve of the American Revolution, colonial Americans were the most prosperous people on earth. The average colonist earned about 13 to 16 pounds per year. And that sounds like almost nothing, and it is almost nothing in modern terms. But history tells us that the American colonies led Great Britain in per capita purchasing power from 1700 and possibly as early as 1650. And this represented the highest incomes, think about this, in the world at the time. They were ahead of Britain by 38% in 1700 and by 52% in 1774. The free white population of colonial America had the highest standard of living in the world. From just 1700 to 1774, the total output of the 13 colonies increased 12-fold. And this wasn't because of a king, a central plan, or a government program. The founders didn't just inherit this prosperity, they understood why it existed. And then they built a republic designed to protect it by codifying the virtues of personal responsibility and private enterprise to foster human flourishing and material well-being. But the story really doesn't begin with the founders. It begins on a cold shore in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. The Pilgrims arrived with a charter that required communal farming. Everything produced went into a common storehouse, and it was distributed equally, regardless of effort. It sounded just and fair. It was, in practice, a catastrophe. As Governor William Bradford recorded in his own hand, the system, quote, was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment. Young men resented working for other men's families without compensation. Imagine that. Women claimed illness to avoid the fields. Productivity collapsed. Within 2 years, nearly half the colony had perished. This was not a failure of character per se, it was a failure of institutions. It was the predictable result of severing effort from reward, of ignoring the truths of human nature. And Bradford, to his great credit, recognized this. He saw that it doesn't work because it requires the planners to behave, in his words, as if they were wiser than God. He responded in 1623 by dividing the land into private plots. Each family farmed for themselves. And Bradford records what happened next with almost childlike wonder. Quote, "It made all hands very industrious, as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. The women," he writes, "now went willingly into the fields, even bringing their little ones with them." In 4 years, they had gone from starvation to surplus. The same people, the same land, an entirely different set of rules. The first Thanksgiving wasn't a celebration of collectivism. It was a feast made possible by abandoning it. Private property, a recognition that people respond to incentives, and the freedom to keep the fruits of your labor are a recognition of both human anthropology and economic truth, and are the difference between poverty and flourishing. The founders understood this deeply. They were not merely political philosophers. They were students of human nature, and they were building something the world had never seen, a commercial republic. They knew that a nation of free, self-interested people trading with one another across state lines would generate prosperity far beyond anything a directed economy could produce. The Constitution they designed was, among other things, the largest free trade zone in the world at the time, prohibiting tariffs between states, establishing a common currency, and creating the legal infrastructure for commerce to flourish. The Commerce Clause codified these principles into our founding documents, recognizing that power is always a corrupting force, and that the accumulation of power would erode a commercial republic and its egalitarian material opportunities, replacing them with tyrannical political privilege that not only creates winners and losers, but also institutionalizes them through law and regulations. The founders knew that to keep the republic, we must codify and protect free enterprise, which was a prevailing virtue at the time. And embedded in all of this was a transcendent vision of what freedom was for. George Washington repeatedly referenced a verse from Scripture, Micah 4:4. "They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid." In his letters and speeches, he referenced this 40 times. This was not decorative for Washington. He used that image of the vine and fig tree not merely as a picture of personal retirement, but as shorthand for an entire political philosophy. Property rights, the rule of law, limited government, and the freedom to pursue one's own calling without fear of coercion or confiscation. He wrote it as a blessing and as a promise. The founders were not building a welfare state. They were building the conditions under which ordinary people could pursue extraordinary lives of their own choosing. That vision was rooted in the economic way of thinking, a phrase we use at TFAS all of the time. What does that mean? It means that people make choices under conditions of scarcity and radical uncertainty in pursuit of their own interests. Moreover, people are the only source of human capital, and that human capital is infinite. Human beings have dignity but are limited in their knowledge and skills. With the right institutions, though, again, including property rights, voluntary exchange, the rule of law, limited government, sound money, and free trade, there would be almost no limit to material well-being and human flourishing. The founders' framework worked, and the world noticed. When Alexis de Tocqueville came and visited America in 1831, just 55 years after the signing of the Declaration, he was astonished by what he found. And he wasn't really astonished at the government, he was astonished at the people. He wrote that, quote, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations, religious, commercial, moral, and educational associations. Wherever in France you would find the government doing something, in America you would find a voluntary association doing it instead. Tocqueville observed that the strong role personal faith and religion and religious freedom played in American life was strengthened, not weakened, by its separation from government. He warned of what he called soft despotism, a government that, in trying to do everything for people, slowly crowds out their freedom, their initiative, and their dignity by making them wards of the state. The founders feared this. The Pilgrims learned it the hard way. Bradford's great gift was recognizing that the problem wasn't the people, it was the system. Change the incentives, and the same people who were languishing become industrious and, as a result, prosperous. Fast forward to today and ask whether these institutions held. Time for some more data. The United States has a GDP of approximately 31 trillion. This represents 26% of global output. In a single lifetime, we've added nearly $31 trillion in economic value. Economists refer to this as the hockey stick of economic growth. You can imagine that shape. But GDP is really just a proxy for material well-being. It represents one's ability to be able to pay the rent, to buy a home, to send your kids to college, to put food on the table. To see this abundance in physical form, we turn to my favorite topic, and those of you who know me know where I'm going with this, the American grocery store. So yeah, I mean, on my tombstone, it's gonna say, she loved Kroger, or something like this. Today, the average supermarket carries over 30,000 items. Walmart, it's far more, and Walmart is the world's largest grocery store. There was no such thing as a grocery store in 1776, not as we know them today. This is not a natural phenomenon. It's an institutional one. Those items are only there because of the rules of the game: property rights, price signals, the freedom to compete. When you break those rules, the shelves go empty every time. It happened in Plymouth in 1621, and it's happening in a country like Venezuela today, where citizens are forced to barter for groceries out of the trunks of their cars in alleys because political leaders chose to concentrate power and defy these principles. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we simultaneously mark the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. The full title is An Inquiry into the Nature and the Causes of the Wealth of Nations. We must remember Smith's core insight that wealth accumulation is a social process powered by the division of labor and free trade. By lowering barriers and allowing goods, capital, and ideas to flow, societies expand opportunities, lower costs, and increase overall wealth. Trade is not just about accumulating more stuff. It's about exchanging ideas and developing shared principles. We serve the common good better through free enterprise than through technocratic planning. This is Smith's point about the butcher and the brewer and the baker. We serve our neighbors best not by managing their choices, but by protecting their freedom to make those choices. In a free market, we only reward individuals with profit when they successfully serve their neighbor. Smith's political economy was grounded in a realistic understanding of human nature as well. As the father of modern economics, as he's now known, he knew that human flourishing didn't depend on us finding good men, quote unquote, to run society. Instead, we have to take people as they are, the good and the bad, and find ways to direct their self-interest toward the common good. James Madison echoed this truth in Federalist 51, reminding us that because men are not angels, government must be constrained. But the brilliance of the American system is that it doesn't just constrain the state. It uses the market to constrain the individual. While the Constitution constrains the government, the market constrains the producer through the relentless discipline of profit and loss. The founders read Adam Smith. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, who turned 283 yesterday, so happy belated birthday to TJ. He carried the wealth of nations around with him beyond our own country in France, running around with it under his arm, saying, you know, you guys should all read this. It's recommended reading because you need to understand these principles, and these principles have to buttress our economic and political institutions, or they're going to go awry. And I think this brings us to the most important point. This prosperity did not happen accidentally. The founders did not just hope for it. They forged a framework that made American innovation inevitable by institutionalizing economic freedom. They understood that trade is not a zero-sum game, and that property rights are the foundation of human dignity and productivity. As Smith showed us, wealth is not to be divided, but to be multiplied. G.K. Chesterton once remarked, "We are perishing from want of wonder, not want of wonders." The abundance of our markets, the hockey stick of economic growth, all the things that are in Walmart waiting for you every day are wonders indeed. But we must not take them for granted. And they coincide with limited government, checks on political power, and political liberty. Bradford was right in 1623, and that truth remains today. We are the stewards of the most successful experiment in human self-governance in history. As we celebrate America 250, let us be worthy of it and create courageous leaders and citizens so we can pass it intact and thriving to the next generation. Thank you so much.
Anne, thank you so much. Lot to dig in there. I guess you raised Smith at the end, so I think I want to start with that. As we're 250 years out from the Wealth of Nations, it seems that after so long, a thinker can become kind of a caricature of themselves, or we forget certain things. So, what are some lost lessons in your view that policymakers and citizens need to regain from Smith today? And in line with that, you mentioned that he was concerned with morality as well as economics, and there's a kind of synthesize these. Is that a corrective we're in need of today?
I'll try to answer both parts of those. I do think that some of the lost lessons of Smith that we forget today, especially in kind of an era of very big government. I mean, the United States is very much a successful project. We've talked about that already. We have one constitution. We've had it for a very long time. But I think what Smith and our founders worried about is somewhat happening. We have a very large state. We have a very large administrative state. We have a massive code of regulations that makes it difficult for people to do what Adam Smith said people could do. So I think Smith's, he brings a lot to the table, but I think what we could really implement in the policy space, and just as we think about government in general, is that when you leave people to their own devices with the right set of incentives, look what happens. It's remarkable. The lives that we lead, I mean, we woke up in hotel rooms today. Some of you woke up in your own home. But one of the things I have my students do is I say, do you know how many outlets are in your dorm right now? And they have no idea. And I say, well, I'm with you. I've been asking my students this question for 15 years, and I don't know how many outlets are in my house. So why is that important? Because we have so much energy abundance. Anytime you want to plug anything in, it's just right there for you, right? If you live in North Korea, you don't have any light after the sun goes down. So, it doesn't even matter if you have outlets in your house. So I think that's a striking example of a society that provides the right incentives, where government is the referee, not the player, and it allows people to flourish. You do a lot. And I think where we've gone wrong is to kind of substitute the government. Instead of being a referee, it's an active player in the economy. And that creates a lot of problems. And Adam Smith was worried about those problems. And, mercantilism, but just also kind of business interests being aligned with government interests and things like that. So I think that's a great place we could start.
Oh, that's great. And I guess I want to go back to, in relation to the relationship between economics and politics, and it was brought up in David's talk when we, I think in the opening remarks as well, when we talk to young people today, when we poll them, it's concerning, their view of free markets and America, and increasingly we find that young people are fans of socialism. They view it positively, even communism, and they're increasingly viewing free markets negative. Why do you think that is, or especially given the abundance we have and that they enjoy, all the energy, all of these things? What do you think is driving that?
I think some of it we've talked about already is just the education. that, kind of what type of economics and civics education are we getting at very young ages? So my children go to a private Christian school, and one of the reasons we chose it is because they start teaching economics in 4th grade. I'm like, we're in. We're going there. I don't care about anything else. Just kidding. But that's important. That's really important. And so I think we're just, it's never too late to learn these ideas and to adopt the economic way of thinking. I think it's a very powerful set of tools that allow us to kind of sort through good policy from bad policy and intentions from results. So I think we're not doing a great job there. I think, though, when you have such a massive economy and you have so much abundance, you get to take it for granted. It's the outlet thing, right? I mean, the very young people that are advocating and clicking polls saying, I favor communism, are doing it from their laptop in a Starbucks drinking a latte. Socialism doesn't get you that, right? Communism, there's no Starbucks in North Korea, I'm assuming. I haven't checked that. You can fact check me. So I think that there's just a disconnect between what sounds really good on paper, and I think the lure of socialism is very intoxicating. There's these rich people out there, they've kind of gotten rich in a corrupt fashion, and so we need to take some of their money, maybe we need to take all of their money, and we need to kind of divvy it up. And so, I think that sounds appealing. I also will say one last thing. I mean, imagine graduating from college with $200,000 in debt, and you get a great job in New York City, and you have to live in a 700 square foot apartment with 4 people, and you have this guy saying, okay, let's make the bus free. I'll take the free bus, right? Because it's very, very hard. So I actually think that our debt and our regulatory problems are making it worse. And if we could pull those back, young people would have a much more optimistic view of kind of graduating and kind of carving out a new life. So I think there's real stumbling blocks in the economy for them. But I think what we need to show them is that communism and socialism always fail every time they try because they're disconnected from both human nature and the truths and realities of economics, number one, which is we live in a world of scarcity. So we have to kind of think through that in a policy setting. I don't think you win those arguments in one day. And so I think it takes a lot of conversations and time to get people to move on those issues. But I will say it's very concerning, and I think that's why we have a lot of work to do in terms of teaching people what it means to think like an economist. It doesn't mean you have to go be one, but just adopting kind of some of those very simple principles and saying, okay, the minimum wage sounds like a great idea, but what does it actually result in? And how do we pay for it, right? So economists are forced to ask kind of those questions all the time. One is, when we want to do something, the first question we ask is, what are the alternatives? There's never one way to do something. And the second thing we ask is, what is the cost? And if you always kind of relentlessly pursue that way of thinking onto policies, it gives a lot of clarity. And I think that's what we have to just keep doing. But I think that's why it sounds good on paper.
No, that's very helpful. I think we're going to go ahead and open it up to the audience. If people have questions, we'd love to field some. How about right here?
Thank you. It is tax day, our favorite holiday.
It is tax day.
And I would love to hear sort of a historical perspective on how the founders thought about funding the government and taxes and tariffs and the system that they had in mind for how government should finance its activities.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll say one thing. Historically, government was very small up until the 20th century, right? So tax day is probably a day that people are not celebrating the IRS. But you really see the development of the IRS as kind of this, the growth of government accelerates exponentially after that. So the last 100 years has been the most aggressive government growth in the entire republic. And so I think the founders knew that you had to have a system. I mean, the way that the government gets revenue, this is something we talk about in the classroom all the time. Why? Because the government faces scarcity too. There's no magic, kind of pot of money. So they can tax, they can borrow, they can use inflation. They can use a portfolio of those three things. And people hate taxes in America, and that goes right back to our founding. So, but when you poll people today, they really hate taxes. In fact, a recent poll said that most Americans that were answering this poll said they hate taxes. They don't think it gives them really any value, kind of the things they get from the taxes, and that they agreed in this poll that they would be willing to reduce what they get from the government if they could lower their tax burden. But that goes all the way back to the founding. So I think the founders knew, and you see so much language in their deliberations about keeping the government constrained, because if the government grows, you have to finance it. There's no magic. And so they understood that it was going to be a portfolio of those things, but that the government is there to protect the rights that people have, and then it is there to do certain very limited functions as outlined in the Constitution, and not anything else. And so it is the deviation from that over the past 250 years that puts us in a situation today where we're really going to have to start reconciling kind of fiscally where are we going. But so I think that, you know, if the founders were walking around today, they would say, look, this is what I was worried about. If you keep government activities small, financing it is a lot easier. And if you keep the quality of government goods and services high, people are much more likely to say, tax me for this, but leave the rest to the market. So I think we have strayed from the vision, but the vision was it's much easier to finance something that's very small through income taxes or sales taxes, things like this. It's a great question, thank you.
I'm going to push back just a little bit.
Please.
My wife and I arrived in Hong Kong in 1978. Mao had just died. It was the backwater of the world. The GDP was $160 billion, a country of over a billion people. Our GDP at the time was 1.9 trillion. Their economy has grown 130 times GDP at 20 trillion, and our GDP is today, is, as you said, 30 trillion. So there is an example on the face of the earth, and one that is today probably our largest competitive threat on a global basis, that has proven, and we can debate the word communism, okay, and what they have there versus what Russia has and others, so that's a whole different topic.
Sure.
But there is a case in the world where you can sit on your laptop and in a Starbucks in Beijing, or you can get McDonald's delivered in 5 minutes, which you can't get here in any place in China. In fact, nobody goes to McDonald's in Hong Kong. China, they all get it delivered. So they're much more advanced in many ways than we are, and some of those things that you're pointing out you can't do in other communist countries. And this, to me, is one of the challenges that we have with an education system that is emphasizing that as opposed to emphasizing what we have today. And I think that's a great concern. And I was involved with TFAS setting up their operations in Hong Kong years ago and all of that. So I'm very much for what you're talking about. But I do say that there is a living example out there where, while on a per capita basis, they're still behind, but they're growing pretty fast, and probably 10 times as fast now, slowing down now, but because of the pure size. But I just wondered what you had to think about that when you think about the comparative differences between China and the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Excuse me. Hayek had a lot to say about this, and so did Milton Friedman. Excuse me. Basically, what they both wrote about ultimately becomes known as the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis. I don't know if people have studied that, but when you look at Hong Kong, when you look at Singapore, and when you just think about economic growth generally, so Robert Lucas, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, once you start to think about economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but economists really like to think about this, right? His point is that what Milton Friedman said is that it is impossible to have political liberalism without something like a market economy first. So the idea is that you must have economic freedom to be able to get political freedom. And that, if it's true, is kind of very interesting, right? And probably should inform foreign policy and diplomacy and all sorts of things. But I think the idea is that you get to see all these different, and so we do a lot of research now as economists where we try to track different countries and see if that hypothesis holds. And there was a paper written by Bob Lawson at SMU, who we were with yesterday, in 2004, where they did this data. Hong Kong comes up, China comes up, and others. And then there's been another paper that has come out about 2 years ago that kind of evaluated this. And so to answer your question, I think you're right to say that there are no, those two projects have shown that this hypothesis generally holds, but that there's a lot of transition. And when you look at a country like Singapore, you see that it has very high levels of economic freedom, but it doesn't have political freedom. So you can have your cake and eat it too for some time. Singapore has been like this for 20 years, so it's not kind of new or temporary, it doesn't seem. So I think the answer here, and this is actually part of this debate of, does socialism really not work? Because it seems like you can have a very large government, right? That does a lot of things and gives people lots of goods and services, but also kind of go to Starbucks and have all these other things. And so one of the things that economists like to think about is, what is the tipping point? It is true that there is a limit on how big any government can get in terms of how much it intervenes in an economy, how much it redistributes resources, et cetera. Because why? The revenue that the government has to use to do those things is necessarily scarce. And so I do think that Hong Kong is something to watch. I mean,
I'm not talking about Hong Kong. I'm talking about China.
okay, China is another one.
Hong Kong's 7 million people. China is 1 billion too. So it's a different issue. What happened in China is that they have been able to divide economic freedom, which Deng Xiaoping really brought into power in the late 70s and early 80s, and the lack of a political population that really don't care about that political freedom that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the challenge to the model that we have here in the United States today, is there is a group of people that don't care about the political freedom as long as they get economic prosperity and growth.
Yep, and I think you're right. I mean, 10 years ago, a lot of economists were very optimistic about the direction of China, which is that they were going to get economic freedom, and maybe that meant they were going to get democracy. And now all those economists are saying, nope. So I think this is a point that's very important to raise, which is there's no such thing as economic destiny. So you see across the world, every country prior to 1750 was poor, by the way, in our modern standards, right? But you see poor countries grow rich. You also see rich countries become poor because of very, very bad policy decisions. So I think that, you know, what it looks like in any individual country is different, but I absolutely agree with you. And I think most economists that look at this and say, over the past 20 years, there was a lot of optimism about what was going on in China. And now it's not there. So and that's kind of factors into this academic literature, which is, it says there's no guarantee. All it says is to get sustainable democracy, you have to have free markets and the ethos that undergirds those. But doesn't guarantee that even if you have economic freedom, you will get political freedom. I think China is a living example of that. So I agree with you. Good point.
Any other questions?
Hi, Ann. Welcome to Houston on Tax Day.
Thank you.
Good to see you. You know, on Tax Day, the class warfare warriors are alive and well. The tax the rich mantra is daily drumbeat. Ever since Bradford, we've benefited so much from our system and learned so many lessons. What would be a fundamental change we could make in our tax code to shut those folks up and also put our government on a more affordable course? Would it not be a consumption-based system rather than taxing people's savings and income?
Perhaps. I think if I could answer that question, you should put my name in for the Nobel Prize next year. This is a tough question because I think, you know, kind of the warriors on tax the rich, you know, it's hard to imagine, at least superficially, having a conversation and convincing them that that's not accurate. And that you can, I mean, we can tax all the billionaires, round them up and take all their money, and we couldn't finance the US government for 1 year. So the math doesn't math, as they say, right? I think that the tax code is something like over 90,000 pages right now. It's so complicated and so obtuse that it's very costly to execute. It's very hard to pay your taxes. It's very, you know, you have to hire expensive CPAs and things like this. So I think there's easy ways to simplify it. But I don't think we have the right incentives to do those. I think it could be kind of a flat income tax plus a consumption tax. I mean, there's a lot of kind of streamlined examples out in the world where it would be easier to simply pay your taxes. But I don't think we have the right incentives. I mean, at the end of the day, the United States government does not have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. And I think we have to realize that, is that we can tax and continue to raise taxes. You're seeing this in different cities across the United States, and it doesn't solve their problems. In fact, the cities with the highest taxes, you know what happens? Rich people leave. This is happening in New York. It's happening in Washington State. You're looking at all these different states now that are enacting wealth taxes. Wealth taxes don't change, you know, kind of the amount that we're giving to the middle class or the lower income groups. It simply moves rich people to other zip codes. And I think what it fundamentally doesn't do is change structural inequality, and what I mean by that is political privilege. I think we need to remove political privilege from the tax code, and again, it's very hard to have a practical implementation of that because the very people we need to do it have no incentives to do that. So it's a reformation of the system, I think, that's required to get us there. So again, if I figure that out, you'll put my name in for the prize, right? I mean, I'm just joking, but this is a lot of way smarter than me. People are thinking about this. But I think it's not a math problem. I think it's an incentives problem. And those are much more difficult to solve.
Time for one more.
And I have to ask this, since we're in Texas, you love grocery stores. Do you have any stories about grocery stores in the Houston area that might involve Boris Yeltsin?
I do. Thank you, Roger Ream. I was going to put in my remarks, but then I knew I would talk too long. So this is my favorite story. Roger's heard me tell it 1,000 times, but I tell my students this on the last day of class, because I want to send them off with, I think stories help students learn, and they might not take away a lot of kind of the homework sets or things like this, but they take away the vivid stories. So in 1989, Boris Yeltsin comes to Clearwater, Texas on a diplomatic visit. Mikhail Gorbachev is out. He's going to be the new president of a new nation, Russia, not the Soviet Union. And so he's visiting the Johnson Space Center, which is like very diplomatic, right? And the story is that he says, I want to go to a grocery store. And so the Secret Service makes this happen, and they go to Randall's grocery store, which is still in operation, I hear. I tell this so much, we should have scheduled a visit. And you can Google this story. You should Google the story, because there's so many great pictures on the internet of this visit. And he's, it's like Costco. He's like walking up and down the aisles with his wife. My very favorite picture that I show my students, he's standing in the popsicle aisle. You have to remember, it's like 1989 or 1990. So this is not a fancy grocery store with like censored lights and cases. I mean, it's just like a bin. And he becomes enamored with pudding pops. If you were alive in the 80s, you know what these are. It's like a fudgesicle. And so he eats the pudding pop. They're giving him all these samples. He starts having the pudding pops shipped to the Kremlin. So now this is our new diplomatic strategy. Just send people the fruits of capitalism and they'll become reformers. But he's walking around the store and he writes about the visit later in his autobiography, and he says he's both overwhelmed and depressed. He's overwhelmed at the stuff waits for the people. Because in the Soviet Union, 80 years of food lines and all sorts of other lines, 80 years, right? And you go to the store and it's empty and there's nothing for you and you have to figure something else out. And he just couldn't believe that there's these like housewives and they're pushing the shopping cart and they're not like excited. And I tell my students, have you ever dreaded going to the grocery store? And everybody says yes. It's like an errand, a chore. And so sometimes I actually, if we have time, I take them to the grocery store. And then they think I'm really weird. But I want them to, it's the Chesterton quote. Boris Yeltsin, I think the point I want to drive home is that Boris Yeltsin was an establishment Marxist. He was an elite member of society, so he had money, power, minions. That's my favorite part. I'd like to have a minion someday, whatever that means, right? He had all that stuff, and he's like, I don't believe all the propaganda about grocery stores. Take me to one. And then it changes his life. So we need to have wonder about the ordinary, because only for us it's ordinary because of free markets and political liberalism. But for Yeltsin, again, an establishment guy, he's like, I don't believe this. And then it transforms his life. So that's my favorite grocery store story.
Well, Anne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great place to end. We're going to break for just a few minutes, and we'll reconvene here for the keynote address.
Hello, my name is John Demos, and I'm in the Development Office with the Fund for American Studies. I'd like to also welcome you and thank you for coming. It's my pleasure now to introduce a student testimonial from our recent program this summer. Madison Evans is a senior at Texas A&M University and will graduate in May with a BS in Political Science and minors in Philosophy and Communication. She also currently serves as the Talent and Culture Associate at Texas Public Policy Foundation. Throughout her time in college, she has gained experience in public policy and government relations across state, federal, and nonprofit sectors, including the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the legislature, Live Action, and the National Association of Advertisers. Her writing has been published in Live Action News and the Texas A&M Undergraduate Research Journal of Law and Society. On campus, she serves as the Vice President of Turning Point USA, where she has played a key role in planning and executing large speaking events, including hosting Charlie Kirk back in April of 2025. In the summer of 2025, Madison participated in our program in the Business and Government Relations track over the summer in DC. She interned with the National Association of Advertisers, and she's originally from Troy, Texas. She enjoys country dancing, wake surfing on the lake, and a good thrift find. And for as long as she can remember, Madison has been committed to advancing American values, and she's excited to continue contributing to making Texas and America the freest places on earth. So please welcome Madison.
Howdy everyone, my name is Madison Evans, and like John said, I currently serve as the Talent and Culture Associate at Texas Public Policy Foundation. And in just 3 weeks, I will graduate from the greatest university in the state of Texas, in my biased opinion, Texas A&M University, with a BS in political science and minors in philosophy and communications. But last summer, I had the opportunity to join the TFAS program on the Business and Government Relations track as a Liberty and Learning Scholarship recipient, and I am incredibly thankful for that opportunity and just the culture and enrichment that I learned and gained during my time in DC. Walking into my time this past summer, I desired to grow both professionally and expand my network, and the Fund for American Studies provided me the opportunity to do just that. Through numerous site visits, including the House of Representatives, networking events, and learning opportunities, I was able to invest in my network and adapt to the very fast-paced culture of Washington, D.C. Being in Washington offered me the pathway to numerous different coffee chats, which if you aren't familiar with what that is, it's a quick 30-minute conversation with other people in order to network and get to know more about their career path. And each of those conversations were very beneficial to me and helped to develop the trajectory of my career. During my time in those 2 months, I was able to sit down with various different Hill staffers, members of the White House staff, different government departments, as well as members of the nonprofit sector. And those individuals gave me a wealth of knowledge that helped me develop my vision for the future. Another aspect of the TFAS program that I deeply value is the emphasis on hands-on learning experiences. This occurred through cultural enrichment, which was tailored to inspire everyone to contemplate serious ideas that impact our nation's future, like the others talked about earlier on this stage, whether that be the impact of communism, the economy, the importance of constitutional rights, etc. The program is designed to foster honest conversations around these issues. I would often walk into the dorms or just the different TFAS events, and students were talking about these ideas, and it was very encouraging to be able to see them talking through these different conversations. But regardless of political affiliation or background, these young adults were able to engage in civic discussions and debate. And I believe this is one of the reasons why TFAS stands out among other programs, because it educates students on how to work together with others to achieve common goals, regardless of their background. In my workplace this summer, I did not always agree with the personal politics of my coworkers, but we were able to work together to achieve common goals. And that's why I am thankful to TFAS for creating a space where ideas can be challenged, discussed, and debated with the utmost respect for each individual involved. The opportunity to be enriched in the deep history and culture of the nation's capital, learn from experienced professionals, and gain firsthand experience for a summer is an opportunity that I will forever be grateful for. I will always remember listening to Lee Greenwood sing God Bless the USA live at the Army Parade, meeting Riley Gaines on the National Mall, shaking hands with former TFAS alumni who are now members of the House of Representatives, the countless coffee chats, the beautiful historical buildings, and all of the educational opportunities that helped develop my career. And it was because of donors like you and your generous hearts that these experiences were a possibility for me, and I will forever be thankful for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madison. Thank you. Well, now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, TFAS America 250 visiting fellow Lord Daniel Hannan of Kingsclere. We are thrilled to have him traveling around the country, speaking about why America's founding principles are important not only to us Americans, but to the world. Lord Hannan served for over 20 years in Brussels in the European Parliament, representing the United Kingdom there. That experience, in part at least, led him to the decision that the UK needed to leave the European Union. And he was a founder of Vote Leave. He served on the board of it through to the referendum that led to the successful departure of Great Britain from the EU. He is author of a number of books, two that I'll mention here because they're very relevant to our topic. The New Road to Serfdom, A Letter of Warning to America, and Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. Both superb books that I recommend. He writes regular columns in the Washington Examiner and the Sunday Telegraph, as well as other places. Occasionally you'll see him in the Wall Street Journal. He appears regularly in different types of podcasts and interviews. He won an award, the Bastiat Prize, one year, and also won I won't remember the exact title, but a speech award. And so if any of you want to be entertained, just put into your Google browser Daniel Hannan, Gordon Brown, Brussels, European Parliament, and you'll watch one of the greatest speeches ever delivered in a parliament, I think, as he questioned his prime minister when he came to the EU. We're thrilled to have him with us because of his expertise on the American founding and many other topics, and he delivers it with an English accent. So please welcome Daniel Hannan.
Well, Roger, thank you very much for those kind words. And cousins, happy birthday. What a thing to get to 250. That is no small achievement. A lot of anniversaries at the moment. It's the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which invented modern economics as we know it. 250th anniversary of the publication of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. A lot going on in 1776. And then there are all the anniversaries we were just hearing about. Anne mentioning that it was Jefferson's birthday, it's the day of Lincoln's assassination, it's that tax day, as we've just heard. And that here's a TFAS proposal that I really liked, that Roger was suggesting that tax day should be moved to the beginning of November so that it's in people's minds when they vote, rather than being at this time of year. But you know, there's another anniversary, a Texas-specific anniversary, which is a couple of days away. We are 190 years on from the Battle of San Jacinto. And I want to talk a little bit about what makes Texas the most American state of all. And it goes back to what happened on those plains, the spring winds just flattening the grass, the sun glinting on the hidden pools, the oak trees standing in groves, and this ragtag force of farmers and settlers and dreamers, outnumbered and outgunned by a vastly superior Mexican army, but determined to live as free people. They would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. And so the cry goes up, remember the Alamo, and against all the odds, this force not only defeats Santana's army, but actually sends Mexico into a spiral from which it's never properly recovered. And Texas then makes a decision uniquely to join the United States as an independent republic. It's the one state whose Americanness was a choice and not a fact of geography. And for that reason, I think Texans are more aware of the special qualities that elevate and ennoble the American Republic. They carry the memory of sovereignty with them. And when we, outside the US, think of America, when we think, whether you look to the stereotypes of your friends or your detractors, what are they doing? What are they picturing when they think of an American? They're basically picturing a Texan. It's the cowboy boots and the 10-gallon hat. It would have been a 2-gallon hat if Kamala Harris had won and the inflation had kicked in with the petrol prices, and you'd have needed all of it just with your $100 bills to tip the valet. But do you know, there's that character, isn't there, in The Simpsons called Rich Texan. I think he's only called Rich Texan. That's pretty close to the view that the rest of the world has. Do you know what? Own that one. I mean, what is it that we're caricaturing? We mean independent-minded. We mean self-reliant. We mean people who look to themselves for solutions rather than looking to the government. When the hurricanes hit, when the drought cracks the soil, people do not go rushing to the federal government to say, help us out. They look to their communities, to their churches, or in the first instance, to themselves. And this has been an extraordinarily successful and winning combination. Right? It's why so many people are moving here. Now, of course, that creates problems, but they are good problems to have. Trust me, guys, you do not want to be in a place which is suffering from net emigration and population loss, right? You show me a country which is losing people, and I will show you a place that you do not want to live. So people wanting to come to this state, either from the rest of the US or from the rest of the world, is an extremely good thing. And by the way, I think you handle it very well. In my country, we face the problem of people who come from ill-governed hellholes and often struggle to get away from the things that made them emigrate in the first place. And of course, in Texas, you have exactly the same issue. In our case, it's people who are coming from the poorer parts of Africa and Asia. In your case, it's Democrats coming from California. But you've actually been much better at assimilating them and getting them to think and vote and behave like people in a free state. Just out of interest, just testing my theory, hands up if you were born in this state, in the room. It's like about a quarter of you, right? Like I say, great problem to have. Now, one of the people whose hands was up there was Kelly over there, who was telling me that when he was a boy, this was woodland, and he would play here with a bow and arrow. Again, what a great problem to have, right? That level of growth. And it has happened because the right policies have been pursued. Texas is always held up as an example of a place that forces its legislators to have outside jobs, right? Famously, the state constitution allows you to meet only for a certain period every 2 years. I think technically you can prolong the session, but you can't claim any per diem allowances, and it's never happened since the Constitution was first put together. It was a constitution drawn up like a lot of Southern constitutions in the aftermath of Reconstruction, so it was an anti-government document, and it's worked. Look at how many people are choosing to come here, to make businesses here, to make their lives here. All states, I think, grow according to the DNA that was encoded at the time of their conception. The European Union, born out of a popular revulsion against the Second World War, was deliberately centralizing, deliberately anti-democratic. It vested supreme power in the hands of a group of technocrats who were made purposely invulnerable to public opinion, so that democracy would be tempered or moderated by these wise and disinterested technocrats. The United States, born out of a popular revolt against a remote government, sympathy is naturally with democratized, decentralized, and dispersed powers, and Texas all the more for it. But why is it that let's dwell on why so many people are coming here? Not just the obvious thing of having zero income tax and so on, because I don't think they're coming for the weather or for the countryside. Something is drawing people to the US in general and to Texas in particular. Let's just look at this from the perspective of a border state. Let's ask the following question. Why is it that in all the years of the Mexican Republic, not one Mexican president ever had to propose building a wall to keep the Yankees out? Right? Not one Mexican politician has said, I'm going to build a wall and the gringos are going to pay for it. Right? The population movement is overwhelmingly in one direction. And let me share a story with you as myself a Latino. You may not think I looked like a typical Latino, but I was born and brought up in Peru. Tengo el honor de haber nacido en Lima. And let me tell you a story from when I was 5 years old, and a mob attacked our family farm. And I have it's my earliest really vivid memory, because you don't forget this. My father was suffering from one of those debilitating diseases that chronically afflict white men in tropical countries. And he was paper thin and wearing his dressing gown. And I remember my mother kept on saying, let's leave. And I remember him loading his pistol and saying, I'm not leaving. There's people here who depend on us. This is a mob that's been bussed in. This was the Peru of General Velasco, beginning of the 70s. There were land invasions all over the country. It was falling into a state of chaos. And I remember my mother taking me. There was a footpath, a back way out leading into the hills. And I remember her taking me by the hand and saying, we're going to play a game. If we have to come this way again, don't make a noise. Right? That stays with you. And it was only much later that the most shocking thing about that whole episode really hit me, which is that no one had found it shocking. That civil order in that part of the world was seen as contingent. That the rule of law was seen as something that could be suspended at the whim of a government if it stood in the way of some policy objectives. Because this government at that time had committed itself to a general nationalization of property, as always happens, people decided to jump the gun and take the law into their own hands. And that was the kind of breakdown that we all took for granted. Now, why does that not happen here? And that's why, it's another way of putting the same question. Why is the population movement overwhelmingly in one direction? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the longevity of the Republic. It has a lot to do with the anniversary that we're celebrating this year. In the time that you have still been on your first constitution, in my native Peru, we're now on our 12th. And by the way, that is remarkably conservative by South American standards. In Venezuela, they're on their 26th. In the Dominican Republic, they're on their 32nd, right? And so you can see that there's been this huge difference. Now, again, why? Why is it? Because most Latin American countries became independent, let's say at some point between about 1810 and about 1822. And most of them copied versions of your constitution. It was already seen as successful by the early 19th century. So they downloaded versions of it with a separation of power and the 3 branches of government and all the rest of it, and yet, almost without exception, they have lurched from one revolution to another, from one dictatorship to another, partial exception of Uruguay, which has always been the sort of square kid on the block, but everywhere else, you've gone from different regimes. And I think the reason for it is a very simple one. We are, as a species, programmed to think that outcome matters more than process. So it is the most natural thing in the world to say, we are the good people, we are in charge now, we can't possibly allow those idiots who will destroy the country to come in and undo everything we've achieved simply because they happen to enjoy what may very well be a transient and fleeting majority. And that's why we have constitution after constitution, when every new regime comes in and tries to keep itself in office. I have a fellow Peruvian at the Cato Institute called Ian Vasquez, he came out with the fantastic phrase, constituciones desechables, disposable constitutions. He said, this is the fundamental problem with Latin America. People don't get the concept of passing through institutions that are bigger than they are. They take the view that if you've won, you're the biggest guy, you get to make up the rules as you go along because you're patriotic and you're the father of the nation. So now let me ask you a much tougher question. Is South America becoming more like the US? Something I used to think it would do. Is it learning to elevate process above outcome? Is it getting used to the idea of sometimes losing an election? I have to say very little sign of it. Right? My native Peru is in the 5th day of a presidential count already. They haven't even finalized the count. And there are already mass demonstrations in every city complaining about fraud. Right? People started with who do they want to win? And then if they don't think their guy is winning, that must be fraud. Okay, sound familiar? Now, ask the other side of that question. Is the US becoming a little bit more like Latin America in its approach to politics? Have we got to the point where the losing party, whichever party, automatically now goes to the court to try and overturn any election result with which it disagrees? Have we got to the point where you now have politicians regularly calling for their opponents to be locked up? Something, again, never used to happen here. One of the things that made it different from Bolivia or whatever, right? You didn't generally have to fear judicial persecution simply because you'd lost an election. Is that a line that is being crossed, and are people being surprisingly blasé about crossing it? If those things do happen, it shouldn't surprise us, because it's really the US that has had the exceptional and unique experience. The US is the outlier here. Most of the rest of the world is like Latin America. We're a tribal species, we're social primates. It's the most natural thing for us to divide the world into my tribe good, your tribe bad. The extraordinary thing is the documents here and the attitude to them that has sustained them and kept them going through all of the vicissitudes. David Bobb quoted or referred to Calvin Coolidge's speech exactly 100 years ago for the 150th. I'm just going to quote a line from towards the end. He said, "Amid the clash of conflicting interest, amid the welter of partisan politics, every American can turn for solace and consolation to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States with the assurance and confidence that these two great charters of freedom and justice remain firm and unshaken." Surely the longest sentence ever uttered by Calvin Coolidge is as consecutive words. But here's the point, that it's like, here is something above and like purer and nobler and more pristine than daily politics. And we give our loyalty, you as citizens of this republic, give your loyalty to the Constitution, not to the commander-in-chief, not to any human being. That above them is this extraordinary document. That when the rotunda which houses them now in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., was inaugurated, Harry Truman was president, and he said, "We've preserved the documents in every way that science allows. We've sucked the very air out of the cases that contains them. But unless we believe in them, unless we see them as more than just parchments, then this place becomes their tomb." And the genius of this republic has been that up until now, people have seen it as much more than just an old, desiccated piece of parchment hanging on the walls in the archives. People have understood that this is what makes you Americans and that this is what has made your country rich and strong and free. But that understanding doesn't just come as a sort of piece of gnosis. You have to teach it. It's a counter-cyclical and counterintuitive truth. And that is the role of organizations like TFAS. It's this constant work of education. The civic education that David was talking about earlier. Teaching young Americans that they are not a random selection of individuals born to a different random selection of individuals, but that wherever their grandparents were born, they are now inheritors of this great collective patrimony. And that having that sublime inheritance carries with it a commensurate responsibility. That you hold responsibility for your institutions on a repairing lease. That it's your duty to keep them intact and to pass them on in a better state. And those are the difficult truths that organizations like this have to have, because we don't come into the world just knowing these things. None of us. Hannah Arendt, the chronicler of the Eichmann trial, had this nice phrase. She said, "Every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children." Right? In other words, we all come into this world with the same instincts, the same intellectual and emotional apparatus that we would have done 10,000 years ago. But we don't live like we did 10,000 years ago, because we've been lucky enough to inherit this accumulated political structure far greater than any single generation could have produced on its own. And the way in which we discharge our responsibility to maintain the lease is through education, through teaching people, for example, that someone you don't like might still be telling the truth. We all know that that is not an easy concept. You spend 5 minutes on social media if you don't believe me. But an open society is based around it. Teaching people the difficult and counter-cyclical idea that we are not all defined by accident of birth, that we are all free individuals with the dignity and autonomy that comes with it. The great Thomas Sowell, he's still with us, God bless him. The great Thomas Sowell put this beautifully. He said, "You can't sustain an open democracy on the basis that two babies born on the same day arrive in this world with a string of pre-existing grievances." It seems obvious to us, not obvious to most countries, not obvious to most previous generations. If it seems obvious to us, it's because we are inheritors of an unusual educational system. I'm sure you've seen which way I'm going with this argument. Are we still doing that? Are your high schools, are your colleges still doing that? Your universities should be temples of the Enlightenment. They should be keeping alive the ideas of the founders. They should be teaching all these difficult ideas that elevate the individual above the collective, that elevate the citizen above the government. But I don't think they're doing that at all. In fact, not only are they not doing that, they are doing the opposite. Instead of teaching the modern and counter-cyclical idea that we're not prisoners of birth and physiognomy, they are teaching the pre-modern and pro-cyclical idea that the most significant thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is. Well, I go back to Thomas Sowell. You can't maintain an open society if we balkanize and tribalize people in that way. And since we can't rely, with some exceptions in this state, but in general we can't rely on our institutions of higher education to do that, it's up to all of you. And it's up to organizations like this, and thank you every one of you who supports it, to make that argument, to remedy the deficits in the public education system, and to teach people how to be good American citizens, which means how to be free people. I want to leave time for a few questions, so let me close where I started with Texas, and specifically with the words of the long-serving Texas Congressman and jurist Hatton Sumner. He said, in 1937, he said, "We have no king. We are our own governors. If we, the people, fail, constitutional government fails with us." And that's what he meant. It's your responsibility, every one of you. This is what happened in the old courthouse in Philadelphia was not some one-off miracle that made it good forever. It is a work of constant renovation. A republic, if you can keep it. After 250 years, it's a hell of a good run. But are we doing the work to ensure that you're going to have another 250 years of it? Are you still teaching your children that they are the great inheritors of this extraordinary tradition? Are you still ready to speak to and for the soul of this great nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part? So, what I am going to suggest is that we keep the Q&A going until Roger makes a grimace at me or a throat-slitting gesture or similar, at which point I will say that it's the last question. So, and please don't feel that you need to confine your questions to the topic of my speech and the Constitution. If you want to ask me about British politics or Brexit or the poetry of Louis MacNeice or whatever else is on your mind, I'll have a go. So please shoot.
So just to continue the theme, what are some fundamental things you'd like to see happen in this country?
Sorry, what are some
fundamental changes or things you'd like to see happen in this country structurally to move things forward, just as you've described them, on a much larger scale across the country? I mean, your message is fantastic. This is wonderful. I was at the meeting a few weeks ago, but it'd be great if everybody in the country could hear it, and I think it'd be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Well, do you know, I think the best answer to that, and my favorite comment on the US Constitution, was the one given by P.J. O'Rourke when he said, the US Constitution, sure, it's an imperfect document, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we've got now, right? And so what fundamental change would I make? I would go back to what it says in these documents. And the move away from them, I think if Franklin or Jefferson or Adams or Madison were to, if they had been transported forward in time, even to the late 19th century, I think they would have recognized the structure that they created. Yes, they'd have seen that it had been adapted a little bit, but they'd have expected that, right? They built some flex into the document. I think things then started to go badly wrong under both Roosevelts, actually. And since then, the acceleration away has been speeding up. I find it amazing, just to give one current example, I find it extraordinary that there is this absolute unwillingness in Congress to exercise an unquestioned prerogative they have over trade policy. I mean, what's the point of them being there if they're not prepared to do their most basic job? I also find it slightly weird that people have stopped taking seriously their oath of office. Not only not taking it seriously, but actually, in some cases, turning on people who do take it seriously. And I'm thinking, I'm now going to lose half the audience, but only half, I hope. I'm thinking specifically of the way in which people responded to Mike Pence in January of 2020, right? And because I have lots and lots of friends on both sides of that argument, and my friends who were in favor of the stolen election thesis, when they talk about the assault on the Capitol, they will say something like, "Come on, it's a bit of a few losers in fancy dress. Don't call it an insurrection. That's playing the left's game. How can you take it so seriously?" To which I always then say, "Okay, so what did Mike Pence do wrong? If it was just a bit of play acting, what did he do? If it wasn't a serious attempt to overturn the election, what possible objection do you have to this man having seriously discharged his duty?" And I actually find it slightly unnerving that I have to have that conversation with people in this country, let alone with people who call themselves Republicans and whose chief motive should therefore be the preservation of the Republic, right? And its elevation. I go back to what I said in my speech about the importance of understanding that you are passing through institutions that are bigger than you are. I have, one of my eccentricities is I have visited, I think, all of the presidential homes that are open to the public, including Coolidge's, and as well as the obvious, as well as Monticello and the big ones. I think the one that most encapsulated the character of its inhabitant, and I'm sure a lot of you will have been there, is Reagan's ranch in Santa Barbara. Sawn off telegraph poles to make the fence and painted it himself. Very, very simple cottage. I've been in a lot of politicians' houses. And in almost all of them, you have little reminders of status. You have photographs of the owner of the house with the Pope and the Queen. And not a bit of that. The only political touch in the whole of the Gipper's cottage was that the showerhead was shaped like the Liberty Bell. Other than that, it was cowboy novels, and you would not think this is the desk where the greatest tax cut in American history was signed. This is the phone where he was consoling the families of fallen servicemen. And that, as you walk around, you think this is what the founders had in mind. The citizen president who couldn't wait to put down the burdens of office and return to his farm and get on his horse and become an ordinary citizen. Now, I don't want to pick on one incumbent, but how long has it been since we've had a president like that? Right? And if you survey the field, who's the next guy like that? And so what fundamental change would I wouldn't presume to do anything except go back, use the word revolution in its original 18th century meaning of a complete turning of the wheel, a setting upright of that which has been turned on its head. It's a hell of a lot better than what you're doing now.
Thank you so much. There's been a couple terms used interchangeably throughout. I'm just curious, not not necessarily in your talk, but throughout the night, democracy and republic, at one point democratic republic. And as we think about, who we are and what our regime is and, try to return to the original meanings of words, is that a distinction that you think matters? Is there
Yes.
a problem in thinking of ourselves as increasingly democratic, or how do you separate those things?
No, I mean, look, it's a republic, it's not a democracy. That means that there are rules and that the rules are bigger than what may be a narrow electoral majority, right? You see that obviously in terms of how some elections play out. But I think there is a much deeper, for me, a much deeper meaning of the word republic. It doesn't simply mean, I don't think it even primarily means a non-hereditary head of state. I think there is this ideal, and there certainly was for the founders, of the classical republican virtue, that you are self-governing and that you are self-reliant, that you are independent of the state and you want to be in an independent state. And the founders, as you know, were obsessed with the story of the fall of the Roman Republic. Exactly 24 hours ago, I was speaking at Old Parkland in Dallas, and as I spoke, I was looking at this big portrait of the assassination of Caesar. And on every surrounding wall, Harlan Crow has put these quotations from Cicero and Sallust and Livy and so on, and very accurately telling the story as understood by the people who made the US. And what they were acutely aware of was the fragility of other republics. They'd seen not just the Roman Republic, but the Venetian, the Dutch, and others collapse. And so they did everything they could to build a system where you wouldn't need a series of exceptional human beings, because the incentives would be so structured that the collapse would be difficult. And that, to me, is what republic means. It doesn't. It's something very different from just a majority vote. Human beings are prone to put immediate short-term ambition over the wider public weal. And this was why the Roman Republic fell in the end. And it might have been restored. There was a moment just after the assassination of Caligula when the Senate could have restored the old system of government because there was no immediate successor. And a few senators saw the chance, and Josephus is our main source, and he quotes the speeches that were being made in the Senate chamber. It would be enough to live 1 hour under the laws of our fathers. 1 hour under the laws that raised our republic to greatness. And it was only a couple of hours before a new emperor was proclaimed. And then, of course, immediately, you've got to imagine your own congressman and ask if they would behave differently. Immediately, the senators were throwing themselves at the feet of the new emperor, wanting to be the first one and get the reward. So humanity is made of crooked timber. The founders knew exactly what the pressures would be, and they tried to structure it accordingly. But with the best will in the world, and this is the story of South America, you've got to have some basic virtues, and you've got to punish people who deviate from them, if only electorally. Right? If people show absolutely no willingness to recognize the norms, to abide by the guardrails, if they steamroll over precedent, if they fail to distinguish between their private interest and their public role, there should be a penalty for that in a democracy. And if there isn't a penalty, then, as Hatton Sumners would have said, we the people have failed. You the people have failed. So this is what I mean by there is a responsibility on everyone. And I think that, for me, is what Republican virtue is all about.
Could I ask you about Brexit? Are you happy with the way it's turned out? And could you tell us a little bit about your experience with that process?
Thank you. Well, Brexit on its own was never going to add or subtract a penny from our national wealth. Brexit was about removing constraints and allowing us to make choices that had previously been impossible. I have been disappointed by our failure to make those choices. We could have deregulated hugely. We didn't. We actually have now more expensive energy than we had in the EU because we've adopted stricter decarbonization targets than when we were members. We could have deregulated our financial services. We didn't. We could have deregulated our employment market. We're actually regulating it more than when we were members. And we could have gone for proper global trade. We could have reoriented from a declining bloc, which was, yes, geographically close, but in the long run is in demographic and political decline, and reforged our links to other English-speaking common law democracies. We've not done that from a combination of cowardice and safetyism and bureaucratic inertia, and often outright hostility by our officials. I think you will find it difficult in this country to, you think you've got a problem with the administrative state. We would gladly swap our problem with yours. Until you've seen up close how British government works, you would not believe how far the balance has tilted away from the elected minister and towards the unelected functionary. I'm going to give you a small, telling because trivial example of this. We inherited from the EU a series of tariffs on tomatoes, as they're properly pronounced. And even though we really don't grow them, we grow a few of them in a very, you know what the weather is like in the UK. So we can grow a few of them in greenhouses for a couple of months in the summer. We import almost all of them from Morocco is our main source. Why do we have these tariffs now? Right? Even from a protectionist point of view, whom do we think we're protecting? Right? It is the most extraordinary thing. These tariffs that were put in place to protect Spanish and Italian growers, we've left the EU and we still got them 5 years on, right? So every 3 or 4 months, I would stand up in Parliament and I would say to the minister, can you just tell me whether we've still got these tariffs and why? And this was always by pre-arrangement. And the minister would say, thank you for raising that. It's outrageous that we have these tariffs. I've given instructions for them to be lifted, and I expect it to happen. And he would say that so that it would be in the parliamentary record. And as I stand here now, they still have not been lifted. Right? And it really is, it's that sort of yes minister thing, where the civil servant will just say, that's an excellent idea, minister, thank you, leave that with me, and nothing happens. So an incoming government, not just to get the benefit of Brexit, but to sort out our finances, to sort out our immigration, to sort out our healthcare, to sort out our education system, is going to have to begin by fundamentally altering the way in which our government works. Right? Because at the moment, the elected minister is kind of encased in this inert machine. He's stabbing at buttons that are no longer connected. He's working furiously at levers that have come loose. And of course, the electorate turns around and says, you're totally useless. You promised to do all these things, and now you've been elected and you haven't done any of them. He doesn't want to be in that position. But unless we are prepared fundamentally to disempower both the civil service and the judiciary and give power back to Parliament, there's really nothing that any future government can do about it. But by the way, I'm still optimistic that that will happen. I mean, you're 250 years on from Brexit. It looks to me like it's working okay. Countries don't get poorer when they get more independent.
Hi, you mentioned at the beginning how schools need to incorporate more things to help instill patriotism and how that's lacking in the current system. What would you say is the areas in which the American public school system is lacking in order to instill that, or what are some policies that you would suggest implementing to help instill that patriotism? Yeah,
it's a really, really good question. Thank you. So if it were up to me, what would I like to see as the outcomes? I'd like to see a proper teaching of history. Right? I'd like to see the phrase that the sort of 1619 wokies use is warts and all. We're going to tell our story, warts and all. It's a phrase that Cromwell used to his portrait artist. They weirdly never get around to the and all bit, right? So, yeah, every country has had its sordid moments. Yours has, mine has, and every other one in the world. But the and all in the US involves some pretty extraordinary things, like defeating Nazism and defeating communism and spreading global free trade and the rule of law and creating the wealthiest place on the planet, as we were hearing earlier, and attracting tens of millions of settlers from every continent and every archipelago and making them all part of that story, and then turning that dream of freedom into a flag and planting that flag on the moon and now taking it to Mars. I mean, that's a pretty cool and all, right? There's not many countries in the world that have an and all like that. And it is extraordinary that that is not just automatic, that actually, you should have all of that, not at university, you should have all of that before you leave school. That should just be implicit. The other thing, here I agree very much with what Anne Bradley was saying earlier. We need to teach some basic economics, some really simple concepts, the idea of opportunity costs, the idea of trade-offs, the idea of living within your means, not just if you like to have kind of more competent voters at the end of it, but much more immediately and much more importantly than that, because people will then make better life decisions and will live happier and more fulfilled lives. If you don't really understand what the laws of scarcity mean and how you have to adapt to them, you're not going to have as successful a career as if you do. And so we need to, if it were up to me, I would have basic economics and basic history in every, by the time you were 14. How do I do that? Well, look, this is where conservatives understand the limit of state power, right? Rather than saying, if I were dictator for a day, I would thrust my hand in every classroom and make them do this, they still wouldn't, right? So how do you do that? You have to, and this, where it's happened, in the states where it's happened here, it seems to me to have been relatively successful. You decentralize control. And you have millions of parents invigilating the system in a way that one education secretary can't. And there are states in the US which I think are models for the world, which have done this successfully. But we're dealing with a lot of people. The kinds of people who most need to hear the TFAS message in some of the public schools here are the ones who are the hardest to reach. And that's where the challenge is.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Yep.
If one were being uncharitable, they might say that you owe your current seat to a fit of democratic peak in the reform of your house, which we've seen recently taken to another step. Do you think that the kind of democratic revulsion towards a second house that's not popularly elected is a sign of something, or is it just sort of a optional feature of the way a free state can be structured? And should we be concerned about our own Senate?
Yeah, no, it's a rotten system, and it's part of the wider problem of kind of rule by the administrative state. Because if I look around at my fellow peers, an awful lot of them have risen through what we call the Quango sector, the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization sector. So the people who have been on these arm's length bodies of, the press complaints people or the people who investigate police corruption or whatever. So they've spent their lives swimming in public subsidy, and they can't imagine any problem to which the solution is not higher public spending, and that is a real problem. But even if that wasn't the practical problem, you would still have a fundamental issue with what is a parliament for. And let me just, because I think this is a point that your lawmakers here could do with pondering as well. Why do we meet in these assemblies? What was the original purpose of them? See, I think even to call them lawmakers, as I just did, or legislators, which are the words you say, that is to give a fundamentally flawed view of their primary function. They are not there primarily to pass laws, or to partake in debates, or to sit on committees and hold hearings, or even to represent their constituents. Those are all kind of bonuses, but they are primarily there to prevent the executive from overreaching its powers. And I am acutely aware of this in the upper house in the United Kingdom, because we were for 50 years before there was a House of Commons, there was a conciliar form of government created by Magna Carta. And the unique property of Magna Carta was that it had an enforcement mechanism, which is today's House of Lords and then today's Parliament, right? So every king for a long time had made these coronation oaths. I promise to defend the land, I promise to uphold the church, I promise to defend the people, and blah, blah, blah. Great. The unique thing in 1215 was to say, that's cool, Your Majesty, we love all that, but you are no longer the only person who gets to decide whether you're doing it. Right? There is now a chamber that will have the responsibility for making sure that this happens, and there will be consequences for you if you fail. And that ultimately led to the Civil War, the execution of Charles I. And we are reminded of that in the House of Lords every time we go in, because surrounding us at sort of ceiling level are these hunky figures in chainmail representing the bishops and barons who made King John agree to the Great Charter. So and I'm sure that the architects of that chamber knew what they were doing when they put those figures there. They were trying to remind us, you are here to stop the government abusing its power. That the worst thing is not even big government, it's unconstrained government. The key thing for me as a classical liberal conservative is not that the government, I mean, I'd love the government to be small, I'd love the tax take to be, but more important than that is for the government to be limited, to be restricted. And I think that is a message that people need to hear on this side of the Atlantic as well. I think both in the executive and in the legislative branches of government, there is a failure to do that. Now, if I'm right in my analysis, then yes, having one of the two legislative chambers appointed by the executive is crazy, right? I mean, if that was happening in Zimbabwe or somewhere, we'd all be very agitated about it. And the fact that we've got used to it in the UK doesn't make it any better. So I think we do need a change. Weirdly, when it was a hereditary chamber, however difficult to justify in theory, it worked remarkably well in practice because its members, acutely aware of the anomalous nature of their position, were very careful to be diligent and sensible and never to exceed their power. When those hereditaries were replaced by all these quangocrats and grandees of the public sector, any shreds of modesty were lost, and we now have the worst of all worlds, a chamber that is immune to public opinion, is appointed, and yet regards itself as virtuous and moral. So I would very gladly take my chances in some kind of elected Senate, I think that the very last hereditary peers, it's too long a story to get into, but there were a few of them left over as a compromise with Blair. The very last of them will disappear the week after next. And at that point, I just don't think you can have, how can you have a House of Lords with no Lords in it, right? I think that at that point, the pressure for some kind of elected Senate becomes overwhelming. So we've got time for one quick comment from Kelly, because... Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, all of you. God bless America. Good man.
Good. All right. Those closing remarks reminded me of something one of the members of our advisory board, a libertarian legal scholar, Randy Barnett, likes to say is, the Constitution is the document that governs those who govern us. It doesn't govern us, the citizens of the country. It governs those who govern us. And thus, as citizens, we don't take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Our government officials do, people joining the armed forces do, new citizens do, interestingly enough. But the rest of us native-born Americans don't. But I like looking at this document that way, as the document that governs those who govern us. When David Bob was speaking, I thought of, I saw the trailer for Young Washington a few months ago, and I do want to reinforce his recommendation that we all go watch it when it comes out. And I think the producers of it are going to, and the Bill of Rights is going to try to get students across the country to go for free to theaters before it is released to the rest of the public. So thank you for bringing that up. Also, while you were, Ann Bradley mentioned yesterday being Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and you know, Jefferson said that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. And we like to say at TFAS that that's not going to happen on our watch. We're going to do what we can to preserve liberty for future generations so they can enjoy the human flourishing that this generation did. I want to thank our sponsors who make our work possible. Many of you are in this room today, so thank you very much for your support. Whatever level you give to us, it provides scholarships that help students who otherwise couldn't attend our programs to attend those. Almost about 85% of the students who come to our college level programs are on scholarships. And many of the high school programs, of course, are also subsidized, so we can have as many students as possible attending our programs. And we're getting ready in June to welcome well over 1,500 to 2,000 students, high school and college students, into programs here in the U.S. and in Prague. My simple elevator speech, when people ask me, you know, what do you do? What does the Fund for American Studies do? We seek to try to identify and recruit outstanding students from around the country to our programs. We then work to educate and transform them through the programs we sponsor by teaching them the ideas you're hearing about today of limited government and economic freedom, and then send them forth into careers where they can help change the world for the better. And we've been doing it since 1967, and we're determined to continue doing that and keep focused on this mission of developing courageous leaders. So thank you. If you're new to us, we have brochures on the table that tell you a little more about what we do, can direct you to our website. And I'll just close with a great passage from Dr. Joseph Warren, who inspired troops to go fight the British at the Redcoats, the regulars, sorry. They were all British in those days, the Americans and the Brits. But he said before he went out and died, I think the next day, "Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends determining to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you," he told these men, "depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rest the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves." So I think by the work we do, in not only through the Fund for American Studies, we all do in our lives, in our neighborhoods, our communities, we are acting worthy of the precious liberty that we've been granted thanks to the founding of this country. So thank you all for all that you do. We have a reception now outside. Thank you.